Everyone has the right to water, no matter where she lives.
For those of you who are editors and journalists, often we're trying to avoid crap stories, but in this case we're talking about doing crap stories very well. This subject, water and sanitation as a human right, is not very sexy. Most journalists would be, more excited about something like climate change.
I think that it is important to call, how do you say it in English, a spade and something...
A bloody shovel.
Voila. Because I think that one of the problems regarding the lack of attention that is given worldwide to sanitation has to do with the taboo which surrounds sanitation. So yes, let's say shit. Let's say that it is about shit and about feces, about being able to shit in dignity and in privacy, not having to hide behind the bush at the end of the day, risking being raped or being bitten by a snake. Yes, that's what we are talking about. Why do human rights make a difference? Human rights has a certain normative content which says that water has to be affordable, which is something totally, well, not totally, but irrelevant for the MDGs, for the Millennium Development Goals. So what is your interest? What is the value added of having a water tap if you simply don't have money to buy it and the water is not safe and the people cannot drink it? They have to filter it, they have to boil it, etc., etc. But this is irrelevant for the MDGs because the MDGs currently are not measuring, except in some pilot projects, quality. Human rights also says that water and sanitation have to be available in all spheres of a person's life, not only at home, but also in the workplace or in the school. We know that girls, when they start being menstruated, they don't go to school because they don't want to share the same toilet with the boys, because there are no sex-segregated toilets in the school. So this is the difference that human rights make. They force us to look at the people. You look at the Millennium Development Goals and you read beautiful reports. I have one here. Beautiful reports telling you about the progress country A, B, and C, and D is making in making sure that people get access to water. That's beautiful. But all these results mask some hidden inequalities, hidden disparities, hidden discrimination against always the same people inside those countries.
Although we'd all like to think that human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a human right is a human right, no matter if you're in Japan, in Tierra del Fuego, in Alaska, or wherever you are, it means the same thing. But the reality is that it's interpreted in very different ways. So how do you interpret this sort of thing in association with water and sanitation in your particular country? When I think of human rights, and perhaps I'm naive and it's a narrow definition, I do think of human rights, Amnesty International, people in prison, torture, those sort of issues. And in a way, if you spread that human rights message through all these other fields, water and sanitation, and now the internet, where's it going to stop? It sort of dilutes the human rights question.
I think it's true. There is a Western vision of human rights that very much influenced the UN upon its creation. But I think that when you look at the Arab Spring, why are people, well, I didn't make any study on the issue, but why did people demonstrate? Well, because they didn't get the social rights, they didn't get food, they didn't get water, they didn't get work, etc. These are fundamental human rights. Are human rights the same everywhere? That was a question that you asked before. I think that the beauty of human rights, but also the challenge of human rights, is that they don't advocate, human rights don't advocate for a one-size-fits-all solution. States have to take steps towards a progressive realization, which means that, does it mean that from the day that you recognize the right to water, everyone has to get access? No, it means that states have to take steps to make sure that people get access. Starting not with the low-hanging fruits, but with the poorest people, with those who have no voice.
The very fact that my country was a party to this agreement means that they realize that this thing is important. I mean, so for them to sign it in the first place means that they are aware that it holds a responsibility. But unfortunately, we are not aware that we hold this responsibility. And since we now know, I mean, for me as a journalist, it's for me to go back and also share with my colleagues that, hey, do you know we're party to this treaty, or do you know we're party to this agreement, and stir up the debate, not to cause trouble, but to let people know that, look, we signed this thing on an international stage. It was signed on our behalf, and the whole world believes, yeah, Nigeria is part of, but I mean, we're not doing it. So for me, it's for me to inform the people and let the government wake to its responsibilities.
We've sort of analysed the problem and looked at both sides. We've got a terrible situation, a bad news story, but we'd also say actually there are a whole lot of solutions. And the solutions can be technology. They can just be something really quite simple and quite low-tech, but be to do with people changing their behaviour, changing social norms, changing their idea about what's acceptable. And partly what we're doing is that we're looking at what people take for granted and saying, no, we won't take that for granted. We won't take for granted a situation where someone has to go to the toilet out in the open and where they feel that their dignity is at stake and they don't have any privacy. I mean, 2.6 billion people in the world, that's 40% of the population, don't have access to basic sanitation. And again, let's call a spade a spade. I mean, we're talking about a latrine, just a very simple latrine or a toilet that can hygienically separate human feces from contact. And if we can just make sure that people have that. Katerina talked about this terrible fact, and we do hear it again and again when we go to countries, about the fact that girls stop going to school when they start menstruating if there's no toilet for them. Now, if you think through the consequences of that, that's a consequence for the little girl, the teenager. It's a consequence for her family, her community, who's out on having an educated girl. At a national level, we can put a figure on it. You know, we can say that, you know, this affects GDP, this affects national economic growth. You know, there are estimates of, you know, for every 1% more educational attainment by women, you get sort of an increase of 0.4% in GDP. So, you know, we're getting things like bad news stories and real concerns. But the other thing I guess I wanted to say is the flip side is if we can fix it, we get good news and we can really make improvements.
What is it going to do with regards to food security? Because it's directly linked to each other.
We are talking about water, access, right to water and drinking water and clean water, etc. But we have to think about the bigger picture and the use of water for providing food, etc. and how that's really increased. You know, since the 70s, we might have doubled food production, but we're using 3 times as much water to produce it. So you're absolutely right. As people's diets are changing and as we're feeding people differently, that links to what we need to think about for water. And I think it's interesting to put it in the broader context. It also really links into the whole clean drinking water sanitation issue if you think about malnutrition. Because I was talking earlier about the children with diarrhea. They're losing the goodness of the food they're eating. So we have to think about that issue in terms of if we're going to be able to feed the population of the world.
Unusually, Rolf has a constitutional right to water and sanitation services as a South African, which is very rare.
I mean, I want to just build on the good news story, I think, and I can't promise to talk at the pace of my previous speakers here. But I think the South African experience...
She has a flight to catch.
And I'm not Latino, so I don't come with a passion, but hopefully I believe in what I'm saying. Yeah, the South African experience, I think, is really interesting because it gives a kind of a time perspective and a country-level story of what is possible. And it also can show us what it takes, because I think it's one thing to have a right, and it's another thing to look at people that don't have sanitation or water, and it's an entirely different thing to say, well, what does it take to actually bring about services, to build the facilities, to provide the services, and to make them sustainable. And so South Africa in 1996 adopted a constitution which gave everybody living in South Africa a right to sufficient water and to a living environment which is safe, which is interpreted as safe sanitation as well. And that constitution really came out of a crisis. I think we're all familiar with the apartheid story. And the crisis meant that we as South Africans never wanted to go back there, so we said we must put it into our constitution that everybody has basic rights, and those need to be recognized. And the second part of it was that the Constitution says very clearly that the state has an obligation to progressively realize those socioeconomic rights. So understanding that it takes investment, it takes money, it takes time, but there need to be certain things that are in place to do that. So it commits governments to a program, to making funding available, to doing the planning, to investment plans, to building facilities, and to operating services. And I think the good news for South Africa is that certainly for middle-income countries, it's entirely affordable to do this. So the scope of the right in South Africa is defined in legislation. The constitution is fairly vague. It just says sufficient water, but the legislation says that the government must provide a minimum standard of at least 25 litres per person per day within 200 metres of water that is safe to drink and is a reliable supply. The definition for sanitation is a bit more vague. It refers really to an improved sanitation facility, so something that is better than what would just be called a pit latrine or a hole in the ground.
I think that these stories, in terms of reportage, lack an element of persuasion. And I would want to say that in order to have governments to get more sensitive to issues of water, and indeed to be able to convert the issue of water as rights, these stories would have to be a little more illustrative and also descriptive. Your stories being recurrent and also being quite updated. If it is bad, it should get worse. And if it's worse, you should want to give which authorities are not attending to the issues. I think that naturally makes the issue of rights intuitive, and governments would intervene without realizing that it is a question of rights, but it's more like a responsibility.
We start and we end with the same thing: get the story right and inform yourselves and resist bias. Does the human right to water mean that water should be for free? No, that's not what it means. It means that it should be affordable. It must be affordable. People must be able to pay for it. And people should not be excluded from having access to their human right just because they don't have money. So in those cases, governments should help people have the necessary money to be able to get access to water. Normally, when the water is provided by a formal provider, it is much cheaper than when you get it, as it is the case in many developing countries, from informal providers, where the water costs 10 to 100 times times more. Does the human right to water mean that well, we have an unlimited right to whichever amounts we want? No, that's not what it means. It means that we have the right to water for personal and domestic uses. 50 liters per day, perhaps. In other countries, maybe 100 liters per day. It depends also, well, on the climate, on your health condition, etc., on your situation. Are you a woman menstruating? Maybe you need more water in those periods of the month. The budgets. I think that's an amazing tool for you to write stories about. And not only in developed countries, but now also in the developed world. With the financial crisis and the budget crisis and the budgetary cuts, where are the cuts taking place and who are the people suffering most under the cuts? Compare, okay, I don't want to be populistic, but compare, for example, the water and sanitation budget with the military expenditures or with security. I'm not saying that you don't have to invest in other areas, but just compare the proportions. Who is getting the money? It's always the same ones.
My name is Kenneth Y. Best, and I'm from Liberia. I'm the publisher of a daily newspaper called The Observer. I consider it my duty and obligation to focus on problems in the country, whatever they are, whether it's human rights violations in the political sphere, or sanitation, or water problems, and a problem of corruption. I cannot say, as I stand here, that I'm not interested as a journalist in advocacy. If I'm not interested in advocating good governance, who will be? If I'm not interested in advocating clean government and the absence of corruption, who will be? If I'm not interested in promoting human rights, the right for people to express themselves, free expression, freedom of the press, who will I expect to be?
I think this access to potable water supply and sanitation are closely linked to the overall healthcare of the community, as we normally describe in developing countries like India. And once there is overall healthcare of the communities improving, then it would affect the economic development of the country also subsequently. Now, apart from recognizing these as the basic fundamental rights at the global fora as well as at the national level, it is equally important that the political systems recognize them and introduce necessary schemes to implement them properly. Now, the role of media, for me, I feel, should be a dual role. One is that they should make the governments realize that these are very important basic facilities or amenities which the people should have, firstly. Secondly is to educate the people, because in countries like India, where there's 2/3 of the population are living in the rural areas, where there's so much of illiteracy, even if the government, even if at the international level it is recognized as a right, even at the national level the program, a lot of budget is pumped and the programs are being implemented. The acceptance of these facilities is very important, and the people should be made to realize the importance of these things.
I think that it's kind of a vicious circle. If nobody pays attention to the issue, it is not prioritized politically, the monies don't come, you don't invest, the kids die, the girls don't go to school, the women don't work, etc., etc., and you perpetuate, they get poorer and poorer, so you perpetuate this downward spiral.
Our role is to raise the noise levels. I really think it's to shock people, it's to inspire people. Our colleague from India was talking about, educating people and informing government. Yes, it staggers me constantly how politicians and how planners and how people who are supposed to be putting in water and sanitation schemes, what a bubble they live in, because they never talk to ordinary people. If I was a journalist in many countries and I go in and talk to the minister responsible for water or sanitation and I say, hello, I've come to talk about water and human rights, suddenly the red lights go on. I wouldn't get any more appointments, I wouldn't get any story. Perhaps I'd end up in a room with, unpleasant things tied to parts of my anatomy or whatever. I don't know. But I mean, I would be very suspicious of, or very careful about encouraging journalists in many countries to go in and talk in terms of human rights about water or sanitation.
I understand what you were saying about the dangers for journalists and the fact that they are closing doors that were open formally. I think, though, let me give you the example of Egypt. Egypt had never accepted a visit of a special rapporteur before I went there. And I think, I'm not saying that the Arab Spring happened because of me, but what I'm saying is that the right to water and sanitation can often be seen, can be used as an entry in a country in order to bring the discussion on human rights to there. I think it's a good entry point.
We were a bit concerned on whether, the human rights reporters would be interested in something like a social right, more than a political and a civil right, and we were very impressed that there was quite a lot of interest.
It is true, human rights are political, yes, and they embarrass governments, yes, and they put them on the spot, yes.